In this video, I'm going to do the best I can to clear up some discrepancies and give you some potentially helpful tips about the front brakes on the 1984 to 2001 Jeep Cherokee. So this isn't necessarily a tutorial video. If you just want to know how to replace the front brakes, I recommend anything from ChrisFix, as he walks you through every step of the way very thoroughly and professionally. He might not be working on a Jeep, but the Jeeps have a pretty basic and universal front brake setup that's very similar to almost every other car out there. In this video, note we're only talking about the front brakes. The rears have a completely different setup with different year interchanges and everything, so for now, let's just worry about the fronts. On the XJ, there are three main eras of front brakes to worry about. From 1984 to 1989, the steering knuckle, which the brakes mount to, had a separable bracket for the brake pad slides. This means the pads, rotor, caliper, and guide pins are all different and not compatible with Jeep's 1990 Plus. From 1990 to mid-99, the steering knuckle is one uniform piece and they used rotors fully cast with iron. From mid-99 to 2001, they changed from those cast iron rotors to a composite rotor instead, also changing the wheel bearing to adapt that new rotor. It's important to stick within your year range for parts because they aren't compatible with each other. You may have noticed 1999 is a mid-model year crossover. Yeah, Jeep likes to do that sometimes. This means the early model 99s will have cast rotors and the late model 99s have composite rotors. If you happen to have a 1999, there's not really a way to tell which type of rotors you have until you get them off, but I have an older style rotor right here next to this newer style rotor. The left one is off a 95, the right one is off of my 01. The easiest way to visually tell them apart is by measuring this distance. You can see this one's a little bit taller than this one. From the braking surface to the wheel surface on the older style rotor is 57 millimeters. On the newer style rotor, it's 53 millimeters. So a very slight difference, but that's how you can tell which one you might have. So on 99s, you'll have to take the wheels off and measure this distance just to make sure you're getting the right type of rotor. I say do both sides because a friend of mine actually had one of each on his 99. A previous owner installed an early model rotor on his late model 99, so the incorrect cast iron rotor had been scraping against the knuckle for who knows how many miles, obviously causing all sorts of issues. The rotor type is going to be based on whatever wheel bearing is on the Jeep. The newer composite rotors will have 3/4 of an inch between the face and outer edge of the hub. And the old style has only, less than half an inch. I don't know what it is exactly, but it's a lot shorter. But aside from model year 1999 specifically, just order parts for whatever year you have. Otherwise, another very easy way to tell the rotors apart is which one's rusty. Full cast iron is going to rust a lot easier than a composite alloy. So as you can see, this rotor is clearly way more rusty than this one. Another way we can confirm which type of rotors you need is if I attempt to put this old cast iron rotor on this new style wheel bearing. The back of it scrapes against the knuckle. This is obviously not going to work, especially when I tighten the wheel down on it. There's no way that this older style rotor would work on this new style wheel bearing because the old style wheel bearings had this face moved forward probably 1/8 of an inch. Notably, the two-wheel drive models from 1985 to 1992 did not use the same rotors as the four-wheel drive ones. They instead had an integrated grease-packed wheel bearing, and the brake rotor itself is part of the wheel bearing on these ones. The pads and caliper are still the same, but to replace the rotor on a 92 prior two-wheel drive model, you need to replace the wheel bearings too. Check the description for a link to my video on how to do that. Lastly, if you have a 1993 or newer two-wheel drive model, it's the exact same as the four-wheel drives. When replacing your front brake pads and rotors, usually replacing the calipers isn't necessary unless their dust boot is torn or one's locked up, which is what recently happened to me. My driver's side caliper decided to die. There's a bonus video about that whole situation, so I'm overhauling the front brakes with new everything. Alright, here's a clever way to get the pads out of the caliper. Grab the two edges of it with your palms and push inwards and up to unhook these little dowel pin things, and then you can just finagle it out of there. The inner pad is very easy, just snap it right out. The pad on the left has been overheated before. You can see it's cracked, there's a lot of pits in it, it's grooved, it's very melted, and this one just kind of looks like a brake pad. Similarly, on the rotor, this one's been overheated. You can see this stripe on here of burnt metal, and this one just kind of looks like a brake rotor. A commenter pointed out that because of the relatively unusual short lifespan of my brake caliper, that maybe the pads got stuck on their metal slides. Over hundreds of thousands of miles and tens of years, the brake pads constantly slamming against the slides will eventually wear them down. I think that divot on my driver's side knuckle is the most likely culprit of why my brakes locked up. But there's a groove right here. You can see fresh metal. There is definitely a little bit of a divot right there. And if that divot gets deep enough, the pads will get stuck in there and it'll simulate a locked up caliper. It's just starting to rain. I don't know, there's some hurricane or something going on. Whatever, I gotta make this video. So I'm gonna try my hand at grinding this down. Got one of these cut-off wheel things. Not a cutting wheel, but a grinding wheel. I'm gonna try to get that surface as even as I can. Here we can see a good visualizer on how deep that rut is. I went over that whole thing pretty evenly, and as you can see on this side here, I mean, we're already smooth. But over here, I've still got to grind it down a bit. Alright, there we go. Just very, very light scrapes, about 10 times, and now that's all filed flat. Now if I put a brake pad in here, I mean, that slides nice and easy. Mostly because there's more of a gap in here, which is what they provide those little spacer things for. We'll get into that in a minute. I also had to grind down some material on the top side. Thankfully, the only divots deep enough to catch the pads were on the outer side of the slides and only barely on the face of them. What Chrysler should have done is provide those metal slide guard things. You know, that way you could just snap on some of these and never worry about this again. But as far as I can tell, no such part exists for the Dana 30. I turned the steering wheel all the way to the left so I could access this a little better. Just grinded it down a bit, and I know it's not perfect, but it's a lot better than it was. I'm just kind of afraid to take too much material off here. And after it rained for 20 minutes, this all already started rusting, but that's fine, that's fine. And I'm fully aware that my axle seal is leaking terribly. With my new pads in my new caliper, I'm going to make sure the bleeder screw goes on top. Calipers are directional. You have to make sure the bleeder screw is on top, because if it's on the bottom, you're never going to be able to get all the air out of the system, no matter how much you bleed your brakes. So this is the top-down view from behind the rotor. You're just going to pivot the caliper on here just like this. But as you can see, the slide pin is hitting the knuckle. So as you put the caliper over the rotor, you need to pull these out and make sure they don't get binded up on the knuckle as you're putting it on. You can see right here, obviously that's hitting. I push it out to slide it in place. The bottom of the pads will have a lip on both sides. The top will only have a lip on the outside because of the way you pivot the caliper outwards. These little metal pieces often included with new brake pads are spacers. There appears to be 4 varying levels of thickness to them, and you use them if the pads sit too loosely in their slides. Even though I had to grind off some material, the pads still got stuck in there with the thinnest spacer, which is obviously way too tight. They need to be able to move back and forth freely. There we go. With the brake pad spacing figured out, the caliper mounting bolts are torqued to 11 foot-pounds, or just snug enough with a ratchet. Over-torque these at your own peril. The banjo bolt gets a copper washer on both sides of the brake line, and then it's torqued to 23 foot-pounds. Yeah, look at that, nice and smooth. Grinded both the top and bottom. And now the pad slides all the way across there with no problem. The next day I got to work on the driver's side, where I'm also replacing the brake hose. Before I knew what happened with the caliper, this rubber hose was a contender for potential failure. When these hoses break down, they can tear on the inside and act like a check valve, only allowing fluid pressure to travel one way. So you can apply the brakes, sure, but it won't let fluid back out of the caliper, so it remains locked. I had replaced the passenger side hose only like 2 months ago when it was leaking through the top, so that's why I only bought the one. This is held to the body by a T40 Torx bit, and the brake line itself is a 3/8. Now in the video, this fitting came off of here deceivingly easy. If your brake line is at all rusty, be ready for it to complain and potentially snap off. The hard brake line has been replaced before on this Jeep, so I'm a bit lucky here. Now let's equip the caliper with our new brake pads. The inner one just pops in, and the outer one just snaps in. On the old 89 prior Jeeps, the brake pads actually just sit on the slides instead of being attached to the caliper, which slides over them when they're already installed. So, with everything connected, it's time to bleed air out of the brakes. I tried a new tactic called gravity bleeding. Most everyone advises against this because it's not as effective as normally bleeding the brakes, but basically all you do is have the reservoir open, crack the bleeder screw, and then the fluid will just push out most of the air in front of it. Gravity bleeding did most of the work while I sat on my lazy ass and waited for this hurricane to show up, but I did end up having to bleed them the real way. It just didn't take as long as it normally does. So now we're back at full braking performance. Remember, gentlemen, always check the description for links to various helpful sources. Might recommend the rear disc brake swab, that's a good one. And stay safe out there. If anyone's concerned about me, I'm just on the outer bands of this hurricane. It's just gonna rain for 30 hours. Nothing serious by me.